Well, my clock just officially struck 1 p.m., so we are going to get started. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially proud to say that I am the dean here at the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. And so I wanted to virtually welcome all of you to our glorious university, even though it does not look quite this sunny on today. This is a picture of the beautiful place where the big ideas that you hear about in these conversations come from. For those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, we are now 130 years into trailblazing new paths in lifelong learning. We are the first extension of our type in the United States. And it was because William Rainey Harper, when he was setting up the university with John D. Rockefeller, wanted to make sure that the big ideas of this university could reach people across all ages and stages of life. Today, what that looks like is 4 programs that allow you to deeply understand the world and lead examined lives of purpose. We have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We have a basic program of liberal education for adults, and I see a number of graduates just as I look over the names in our audience. And that's an opportunity to look into the Socratic tradition and at some of the great books of Western social and political thought. We have an open enrollment catalog that typically has about 70 courses each quarter across all of the disciplines of the university. That's where Professor Jordan Bimm's class will be when we come to this autumn. And then we have annual programs that allow you to look into a range of opportunities across the university, from understanding our own city of Chicago to the future of museum publishing. With that, let me take down my screen so that you can see our speaker, because we are now into our conversation. Jordan Bimm, who you see, is a historian of science, technology, and medicine, focused on the human and biological aspects of space exploration. His forthcoming book, which I'm excited about, Anticipating the Astronaut, examines the surprising history of pre-NASA space medicine test subjects contributing to early visions of an ideal spacefaring body, including push-button soldiers, high-altitude indigenous people, mountaineers, women pilots, and animals. His current project, Putting Mars in a Jar, recovers the forgotten military origin of astrobiology. He holds a Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Fellowship at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The prestigious fellowship provides the opportunity to work with NASM's curators and collections to further his project about the military origin of astrobiology. And most important of all, he is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Chicago's Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, and they are a wonderful partner in the knowledge series that underpins these conversations and the courses. And so, having given you that description, I now want to jump into conversation with you, Jordan, about your upcoming course and explore Mars a bit in the next 40 minutes. So let me start by, reminding everyone you're a historian. And so you look across science, technology, and medicine. How did you come to the area of space exploration for your research? And then why did you focus on Mars in particular?
Well, thank you, Dean Green, for that introduction. And hello to everyone out there watching. Thanks so much for tuning in to this conversation today. So how did I get interested in space? I mean, I have been fascinated with space for my whole life. And then during my PhD studies, I got really interested into the history of astronauts. And not just like the astronaut as like the biographies of famous pilots, but as the astronaut as like an idea. So that took me beyond the personalities of like celebrity astronauts like Neil Armstrong and Alan Shepard, and into the people who are selecting the astronauts, who chooses who gets to go to space. And it turns out it's this entire field of science and medicine called space medicine that selects astronauts. And now a lot of people think that like most space research begins with NASA, when NASA was founded in 1958 in response to the Soviet launch of Sputnik. But what I discovered early on in my research was that this work actually started 10 years before NASA existed. not as a civilian scientific endeavor, but as a military project, mostly within the US Air Force. So my dissertation looked back at this 10 years of military simulations, expeditions, and studies, all into the limits and capabilities of the human body in the space environment to kind of get at this sort of prehistory of the astronaut. And then what happened was I discovered that these space medicine experts who were working for the US Air Force, they weren't only interested in the astronaut themselves, they were also interested in where the astronaut might go and what they might encounter in places in outer space. And first among their lists of destinations was, of course, the planet Mars. So this early space medicine community at the US Air Force also began a sustained research program into the physical environment of Mars and the question of whether or not life could exist there. And so began the field we call today astrobiology, which wonders, is there life out there? So I decided to write my first book about the astronaut and then write my second book about this lost Air Force astrobiology program focused on early questions about life on Mars. So that's how I came to be interested in Mars. And that was the jumping off point for this entire course about understanding the long history of Mars, the big picture of Mars.
Well, so before we jump into, the course and its chronology, I want to just ask, we were talking in advance, you just came back from participating in a simulated Mars expedition at the Mars Desert Research Station, MDRS. What is such an experience like? I was kind of fascinated that, I actually knew someone who's been part of this kind of expedition. And then how did that experience add to your understanding of Mars?
Right. So the Mars Desert Research Station is what we call an analog site. These are one of many places around the world that have been designated as similar in certain ways to what we think the surface conditions of Mars might be like. Now, the Mars Desert Research Station was established in the year 2001, a joint venture between the Mars Society and NASA. And it is essentially what looks like a science fiction like HAB unit in the middle of the Utah desert. It looks like something you would see in the Martian, the movie with Matt Damon. And different crews of scientists go there throughout the year on simulated missions. They live inside the HAB and they explore the surface as a way to try and gain experience or to test out doing different procedures and methods like that in sort of a low-key preparation perhaps for what may happen on Mars one day. So the mission I was attached to was called Crew 243, and we were called Martian Biology 2. I was assigned to a team of astrobiologists, which was perfect for my Mars book project, which is all about the prehistory of astrobiology. And so I went to MDRS back in June. I lived there for 9 days inside the HAB unit, doing science every day with these astrobiologists out in the field. It was grueling in the heat, 105 degrees every day, searching for different microorganisms and simple plant life that are seen as analogous perhaps for what we might find on other worlds. But it was absolutely fascinating. We focus on how we make knowledge about Mars without actually going there. And this is one of the ways we find places on Earth that are similar, and we do work there to analogize for what perhaps could be beyond the Earth. For me, it was just an amazing experience to get to know these scientists, to experience what it's like to do science in a remote and hazardous environment was so valuable. And the last thing I'll say, which was really interesting, was that we think about going to like a futuristic Mars base as like stepping into the future. But what I realized is that this Mars base actually is a frozen moment of where Mars exploration was about 20 years ago. So we'll unpack this more in the course. But what I was seeing was a little snapshot, not of where Mars is today with Elon Musk talking about a giant city on Mars. This was more of a small science team exploring the surface of Mars, which is more of NASA's vision from 20 years ago. So it led me to lots of insights and definitely a lot of material that can come out in the course.
Well, so for everyone listening, I think one thing that's immediately clear is that Mars has a long history and it has many meanings over that time, right? There's a military involvement, there's a scientific community involvement, there's a business community involvement now with the billionaire space race, and then there's this cultural and kind of civic connection. And so how does your course go about approaching all of this? Give us kind of the snapshot of how you kind of bring people into this long history of Mars and how you go across these multiple dimensions and disciplines that are connected to this exploration.
Well, the whole reason that I just created this course is that the world needs more Mars experts. Mars is coming into focus. Conversations about Mars are happening across society in lots of different venues. And I wanted to create a course that could essentially take someone who might not have a knowledge base about Mars, but just might have some interest in it and turn them into an expert in 8 weeks, someone who can join and perhaps lead Mars conversations as they come up in their everyday life. Now, sometimes if you go to a science department or an astronomy department and take a course about Mars, what you'll get is a natural history of Mars. So looking back at the formation of the planet, its geology, its life, what we're interested in is a cultural history of Mars. So how has Mars in our minds changed over time? And what's really fascinating is that it goes back as far as we have written records for. So humans have always noticed Mars in the sky as one of the 5 planets that wandered the heavens. And then it has grown and it has turned into this fascination. So what we will discuss in the class is sort of the periodization of our fascination with Mars, how it's changed with the advent of, say, the telescope or the rocket. These things sort of change our engagement with the planet and also change what it means for us as well. So, we're going to look at major figures. So who are the major folks who have spoken for Mars over the years? People like astronomer Percival Lowell, rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, astronomer Carl Sagan, today Elon Musk, for better or for worse. We're going to look at some major moments in Mars exploration. So the sighting of possible canals on Mars at the turn of the 20th century, the first flyby by NASA's Mariner 4 probe in 1965, the Viking life detection experiments on the surface in the mid-1970s, and then the ALH meteorite controversy from 1996, where NASA believed for a minute that they had detected microscopic fossils from ancient Mars inside a meteorite. So we're going to look at these major moments and how they have changed our understanding of Mars. And we're sort of going to work it into these periods that really provides a comprehensive synoptic understanding of our total engagement and understanding of Mars. And just because it's a cultural history doesn't mean that science is not allowed. We're definitely going to get into a bit of the science, but what I want to foreground to everybody is that no prior knowledge of Mars is required and no scientific background is required. So we're definitely going to learn about the physical properties of Mars. So we're going to be able to talk about what it's like on the surface and what challenges might face robots and humans there. But our focus is mostly going to be on readings from history and arts and culture, sociology, things like that.
Well, so let's jump into some of those pieces. And maybe we can kind of go in terms of the different communities that have engaged with Mars over time. And maybe we can start with the military community. How has military, and that kind of geostrategic lens influenced and engaged with Mars over time?
So this is a period that begins right at the end of World War II. And this was a time when Wernher von Braun, who was, of course, a member of the Nazi Party and an SS officer, was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip and basically put in charge of designing rockets for the US Army and then later NASA. And his vision for Mars exploration and expeditions was a military expedition as part of the United States Cold War. So the Cold War, as many of you know, was this competition with the Soviet Union, and it was one of the first globally scaled conflicts. And one of the things about the Cold War was you needed to be able to fight potentially in any kind of environment. So the Arctic, underwater, these places that before weren't really part of strategic thinking for warfare became these really strategic environments. So what not a lot of people know is that Mars was also part of this. They were trying to make plans for building an Air Force base on Mars, perhaps to either beat the Soviet Union there or engage them there as well. And not a lot of people remember this military moment because right now we are such inside the science paradigm that, of course, came out of NASA. But for a whole 10 years before NASA existed, there were these plans in place for different types of military expeditions that would have been led by different military services to Mars. And one of the things we're going to learn in class are what are the hallmarks of military science that makes it different than civilian science. And that's a really interesting conversation we're going to get into when we read Wernher von Braun's novel about one of these prospective explorations of Mars. So not only was he an engineer writing technical documents, he actually wrote a novel called The Mars Project in the early 1950s. And we're going to take a look at that. And it has some very interesting stuff in there.
Well, so that is one dimension of this engagement. And I know another, which is obviously related because these intersect, but they still have distinct meaning and communities, is the scientific engagement with Mars, the Carl Sagans of the world. Talk a little bit about the evolution of that scientific engagement and maybe even how it eventually comes to interact with some of the other spheres like the military.
Precisely. And the metaphor I like to use is that when these meanings of Mars change, they don't replace each other. They kind of layer on top of each other, almost like putting a new coat of paint on an old wall. So even though, we're no longer in the military paradigm, parts of our thinking about Mars and some of the equipment and the legacy of that is definitely, comes out of the military. But when NASA is created in 1958 as this civilian agency to compete with the Soviet Union's early space successes, there isn't just a human spaceflight program, Project Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. There is also a very robust space science side to NASA as well. And the first place that they really want to send a probe to is the planet Mars. Because there was this previous idea about life on Mars. At the turn of the 20th century, there was an idea that there was perhaps an intelligent civilization on the surface. Astronomers thought they could see lines on the surface of the planet through telescopes that they took to be canals, artificial creations of an intelligent society. That later subsided over the course of the 20th century. By the end of World War II, what everyone thought was on Mars was vegetation. So simple, hardy vegetation similar to lichens and mosses that could survive in the harsh environment that then they were able to tell lived there. So when NASA was created, they wanted to send a probe to Mars to see if they could see any vegetation on the surface. And in 1965, the Mariner 4 probe flew by and took some pictures of Mars that revealed a surface that looked more like the moon than the Earth, and they could tell there was no vegetation there. But what's really interesting is that they didn't give up hope that there may actually be some life on Mars still that wouldn't show up in those pictures that were taken at quite a distance. And that became our current paradigm of hoping for microbial life on Mars, either in special parts of the planet today, or perhaps fossil evidence that it existed in the distant past when Mars was warmer or wetter. So when astrobiologists took over thinking about exploring Mars with robots from the military who were thinking about sending soldiers there to kind of set up shop and maybe claim that territory as part of the Cold War, scientists were really interested in this thing that we now call the big question. And in astrobiology, the big question is, of course, are we alone in the universe? What is our place in the cosmos? And a lot of people think that that question has just been there forever, but it hasn't. It has a history, and it really wasn't present in the military moment of explorations of Mars. So it's really interesting to see how these sort of cultural engagements that we think are sort of timeless actually do have really important and potent histories.
Well, and so I want to begin bringing us to where we are today, and a big discussion that's taking place is settlement related to Mars, right? The possibility that we would live there, the possibility that climate change would disrupt our planet to a point where it would actually be more inhabitable there. I know these are all in the kind of science fiction world in a certain sense, but they come into, increasingly mainstream conversation today. And so curious for you to just describe what I personally see as kind of this kind of current period where settlement, where Elon Musk is talking about, a city on Mars. How did we get here into this moment? And can you describe, for people that are just watching as amateurs, can you describe kind of the contours of this conversation?
Yes. So right now, I would say we are at a moment of flux or an inflection point in the history of Mars. So definitely right now, we are still on Mars within the science paradigm. Mars, there's no one on Mars except for robots. There are 3 active rovers on Mars. There's Curiosity, Perseverance from NASA, and then China, the Chinese space agency, has Zhurong, another rover on Mars. Those are all there ostensibly to do science, to search for signs of ancient life. But as you mentioned, right now, there is a growing conversation led by Elon Musk about changing the use of Mars away from a place for scientific research and exploration into a site for commercial settlement. And driving this idea, Elon Musk claims, is this sort of threat of planetary annihilation and the need for what he calls a planet B, a place where humanity can back itself up in case there is a planet-wide catastrophe on Earth. And like I mentioned before, sometimes these layers exist on top of each other, but sometimes they also come into direct conflict. So you can imagine a rover that wants to search for signs of life is not going to function properly if humans are there spreading microbes and bacteria all over the planet, because then if the rover detects something, who's to say whether that was there originally or if that was brought here by a SpaceX Starship? So you can see sometimes these paradigms of the use of Mars are in direct conflict. And there's not really a system of regulations to kind of manage that right now. It's sort of just like whoever can get there can kind of do what they want.
Well, this is fascinating. I have one more question, Jordan, that I want to ask, but I want to preview to our audience that we're going to come to your questions soon. So please start chiming in with what you want to know from Jordan. But my final question, Jordan, is about how we look at the future. So, you've just brought us through the military period, the scientific period, and again, like layers on top of each other, this settlement period that we're begin veering into with Elon Musk's commitment to try to get there and commercially settle. How do you, as a historian that looks across time and space and kind of sees in some ways a trajectory to where we are today, where does that trajectory go? Always an unfair question to someone who is studying the past and not necessarily the future, but as you know, the two are very related.
They are. And as a historian, I really do care about the future. I think history gives us the tools to decode the present and shape the future. So, definitely very interested in this. In our class, I'll just mention this as well. The class scope will take us from the earliest visual observations of Mars right up to the present day robotic explorations of the planet. And we will also, as a class, be thinking about the future, the future possibilities. And one of the main principles of the course is, first of all, that space and Mars is not our destiny. It's not something that is our sort of cosmic destiny to fulfill. Mars will be a set of choices that we get to make that are open at this current time. So anybody who says we must go to Mars because it's our cosmic destiny is foretold or something like that is really masking their true motives of why they want to go there. So I do see 2 potential tracks right now open for our future on Mars. One is scientific exploration, small teams of scientists going there to learn about perhaps Mars's history of life in the past, perhaps if we were able to find ancient fossils of life that were there, or perhaps just to learn about planet formation, the history of the solar system. And then the other track, of course, is commercial settlement of SpaceX going in and trying to just establish a city there where people can live and travel back and forth. But of course, that raises a host of questions about governance, about society, about culture. How will Mars change those things from its harsh physical environment? And how will the person who is setting up the rules of the game, Elon Musk, for example, how will he treat laborers, for example, who get sent to Mars to build this city, or wealthy tourists who book a very expensive flight there for fun? Things like that are going to be very, very potent topics of discussion in our class because there is a lot to debate.
Well, so one of the things we focus on a lot at Graham School through the basic program is political philosophy. And I bring this up to kind of piggyback on your point because it feels like, there's an open terrain to, kind of have these discussions about what kind of, rules or norms or laws, right? What kind of social contract in the, vernacular of many political philosophers should you have in this new setting? And I'm curious how you've seen kind of political philosophy and space exploration interact, if at all, because it feels like in some ways space opens up a whole new terrain for philosophers to kind of think about these dimensions, literally out of this world.
Exactly. And one of the other main key themes of the course is that space exploration is always deeply political. No matter why you are doing it or how you are doing it, it is always tied to some sort of political project on Earth. Every plan for Mars or every plan for space is always tied to a plan for the Earth. And that's why we are so focused on Mars right now, is not just because we might go there one day, but because how we go there is going to affect things back on Earth as well. So, you can imagine if you are a worker who is hired by SpaceX to travel to Mars and start a construction project to establish this city, it's easy to imagine how limited your rights might be there when you are on Mars. How do you quit your job on Mars? Say you get there and you don't like it. What options are open to you? How can you protest? If you can't talk in real time to people on Earth, if your communications have to be monitored or subject to a relay system that anyone with authority can tap into, what if your very air supply is controlled by higher ups? So this creates a number of problems for the sort of dignity of the individual that we take as sort of sacrosanct, and there are a lot of people who are ready to throw that away if it means that we can actually go and settle on Mars. And I find that deeply troubling, but I'm also here to have that conversation and see where those ideas might take us.
Mike Reinstein is asking about the real feasibility of settling on Mars, and says, because of cold, is it realistic to think humans could settle there?
I have major questions about the feasibility. And there are people, for example, the Mars Society, who created that desert research station that I went to. They believe it is totally feasible and that we should be going there like right now. I have major questions, not only about the cold, which I don't think will be a major problem, but radiation. That's one thing we don't really understand. On Earth, we are protected by our magnetic field, by the Van Allen radiation belts from solar and cosmic radiation. On Mars, we won't have that level of protection. There could perhaps be built structures that would protect us, either in caves or through 3D printed material, which we will look at in the course. But it's unclear right now how much exposure a human body would get there, and then what happens to you if you, God forbid, develop radiation-induced cancer or something like that on the surface. Also, key to settlement is reproduction, and we're not sure how that would be affected not only by radiation, but also by the different gravitational field there. Mars has about 3/7 of Earth's gravity. So all these different factors are variables, and they're unknowns at this point. Someone may have to go there and just try and maybe perhaps fail to figure it out.
You talked a little bit about the current rovers that are there. William Wilkin asked, what observatories are orbiting Mars and operational currently? What information about Mars do they obtain? And so, can we go a bit deeper into what are we gathering from that scientific exploration currently underway?
This is a great question, because one of the cool things about the course is that each week I've paired a different reading with a different activity. It's all organized thematically, that moves broadly chronologically, but takes us through some of the major themes of Mars exploration over the years. Things like the history of Mars, science on Mars, militarization, is there life on Mars, and then settlement as well. One of the activities asks you to go to a website called Mars Trek, which was set up by NASA, and it is basically Google Earth, but of Mars. It's been created through these orbiting synoptic sort of spy satellites around Mars, including the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Global Surveyor. And part of your job in the activity will be to zoom in to specific points of interest on Mars. And I believe I've selected sites that SpaceX has identified as places where they may make their first landings and establish their first cities. So we'll actually be looking at some of these orbital views from these orbiting satellites, like the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Global Surveyors, which are basically repurposed spy satellites that are sort of given this scientific task in Mars orbit.
Wow, well, that is so interesting. Peter Coddington wants to just get those websites one more time. Can you repeat them?
Sure. Just Google NASA, Mars Trek. And it's a NASA website. And yeah, you can explore Mars from orbit.
Well, so I want to go a little bit further on, where we are today. There's an Artemis mission that is going to be kicking off later this week, and it's the first time since 1972. I realize that relates to the moon, but can you just talk about Artemis and how we're in a moment that is kind of reconnecting in some ways with the long-term history of Mars?
Right. So Artemis is NASA's new moon exploration program. And today was supposed to be the launch of Artemis 1, a test flight, an uncrewed test flight of both the SLS rocket system and the Orion crew capsule. That launch, unfortunately, was scrubbed at the last minute this morning. Hopefully, we're going to get a launch on Friday. Another window is next Monday also. And basically, what this will do is test out the SLS rocket system and the Orion capsule, which is the first human-rated spacecraft to fly beyond low Earth orbit since 1972 when Apollo 17 came back from the moon. Now, the goal of the Artemis program is, of course, to take humans to the moon, back to the moon, both to orbit the moon in a space station called Gateway, and also to establish a permanent human presence on the moon. NASA's identified the south pole of the moon as the place where they are going to hopefully land astronauts first. But every time they mention their goal as the moon, they are always careful to say, and on to Mars. They see Artemis as a stepping stone to a Mars exploration program, which, because it's NASA, is animated by science and exploration. So it is definitely not the plan to establish a 1 million-person city there. It is a plan to go there and try and make some scientific discoveries using human explorers rather than rover explorers. So when we are watching the Artemis missions unfold, yes, they are focused on the moon, but they are also sort of in the distance targeting Mars as well.
So we're going to have a conversation tomorrow with Eva Fernandez, who is trained in English literature, but is teaching a sequence coming up this year on science fiction film. And one of the theses she has is that what we see in science fiction is often a reflection of where we are as a society. And so when you look over time at different films, what you see are different debates happening in our society, and then we're kind of projecting them into this science fiction world. And I'm curious if you see similar mirroring taking place when you look at our conversations about Mars, meaning, does the way that we're looking at Mars actually reflect in many respects the place we are at in society? And you've already talked to some of that because we saw it in some ways differently during the Cold War than we did after the Cold War. But I'm curious if you could just kind of double click on that idea a little bit more, and maybe anything that we learn about ourselves from the evolution in our understanding of Mars.
Absolutely. Mars is a screen that we project our cultural and political values, our hopes and dreams always show up there, which is one of the most fascinating things about digging into this subject matter. You can go back to the turn of the 20th century, where the main voice in the Mars conversation was the American astronomer Percival Lowell. He's the one who thought he could see straight lines on the surface, and that those lines were canals of this ancient, advanced extraterrestrial civilization. And of course, what he was doing was crafting a grand narrative out of this really ambiguous sighting that turned out not to be real. But the society that he imagined there, they weren't just building canals; they were building canals because they were overpopulated, and they were undergoing a global climate change event that was causing severe drought. So that's why spectrographic measurements of Mars turned up an absence of water. He incorporated that into his drought narrative, and that's why the canals existed, to channel melting ice water from the poles towards the equator. So really, he was thinking in terms of these Malthusian ideas that were really popular on Earth at the time, and he was also drawing from the headlines, things like the construction of the Suez Canal. Plans to build the Panama Canal were also in the news around that time also. So we can look at these visions of Mars and we can really see ourselves. And as we go out into the universe, we are also going inward into ourselves.
Well, so I have a question here from an interested student who wants to know what specifically is on your reading list, and what do the readings look like in terms of, are they speeches, are they literature, are they scientific documents? How do you investigate this subject? I know we have a sense of the chronology you're going to go through and the types of people we're going to look at, but what are the primary sources?
So I spent a lot of time making these selections, and basically what I wanted to do is make them really accessible, make them, not too long so that everyone has the chance to read them closely and that we can have a really deep, discussion about them. I don't want people, rushing through an entire book, but I also want to provide a comprehensive sampling of what types of literature are out there. So we're going to read samples from, policy writers who, give sort of capsule histories of the NASA space program. We're going to read an ethnography of NASA's JPL. So an ethnographer who has gone and been embedded with the teams that control the rovers. And we're going to learn how they work as an organizational hierarchy to make decisions as groups about what the rovers will do. We're also going to read science journalism about Mars. We are going to read some historical documents. We are going to drop back into the 1860s and read something by Richard Proctor, who in England was basically the Carl Sagan of his day. And we're going to see what he was interested in 1860 and what was known about Mars back then. We're also going to read a little bit from Percival Lowell himself about his canals. We're also going to read one of his detractors, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was very adamantly against his idea of that there was anything living on Mars whatsoever. We're going to read a few short scientific articles about what perhaps a Mars society might look like, how it might be governed, what the different ideas scientists have about what those societies might look like. And then we're also going to read some popular literature as well. One of the weeks focuses on conspiracy theories about Mars. So we're going to read some popular literature to help us understand why people believe that there is an extraterrestrial civilization on Mars today with the face on Mars and that sort of thing, or people who believe that the Earth is flat and Mars is totally fictitious. So we're going to read some popular literature to understand that a bit better. And then we're also going to read, just some really interesting articles about written by present day people who are trying to parse this debate between SpaceX and people who think that the direction of that is going and is not good. So that's a little overview of the different types of things we're going to read. My emphasis is on accessibility and setting us up to have a really, really fulsome conversation when we all come together to meet once a week.
So we have another question here about how to think about policy development over time and your views they're asking for how there should be governance around Elon Musk's ideas. I know that's particularly specific question, but yeah, I think there's curiosity, general policy, and then what does it look like when you have this being treated as a commercial exercise from a governance perspective in your mind?
I mean, the big question is, how do you control somebody who has the power to act on Mars unfettered? So if the billionaire class is able to amass enough wealth that they can create their own private space programs, what government could really stop them, or what government could intervene, or what international organization could really put enough pressure on them to stop something on Mars from happening that they don't want to happen, that they see as immoral or objectionable. So from a policy perspective, I worry that we are maybe the horse may already be out of the barn, and it may be really impossible. One example could be, perhaps a certain nation would enact laws that would put on punitive sanctions against the company in that country, but then they could just move to a different country, sort of a flags of convenience situation, and continue launches to Mars from there. So what I really worry about is the mechanisms that we have from the past may not work in this new paradigm of other planets. And space law may need, I feel like space action is outstripping or outpacing space law.
Well, so we have one more question for you here, and then we'll hear any final thoughts that you may have, Jordan. And the question is your most interesting aha moment in this work. So you've read a lot of documents, you've looked across history. Is there a particular story that comes to mind for you that encapsulates why this is such an interesting field to study?
Yes, and it happened at the Air Force Archives in Montgomery, Alabama, at a place called Maxwell Air Force Base. And I was there to work on my astronaut project. And that was when I made the discovery that the US Air Force actually had an astrobiology program 10 years before we even think astrobiology even existed. Most people think even astrobiologists themselves think it started with NASA. And what I discovered was a set of documents that outlined what these scientists in the Air Force called astrobiology themselves. And I also discovered that they created the first astrobiology experiment, which was a small, self-contained, almost like a terrarium, but instead of recreating an Earth environment inside, they created the Martian environment, or what they thought was the Martian environment. They called them Mars jars. And inside the Mars jars, they would put different types of hardy life. So things like mosses and lichens and different forms of bacteria and yeast, to see if anything could survive, just to see if life on Mars was possible. And what they discovered was that actually some of those things did survive. And what's so fascinating to me, my big aha moment, was that they weren't interested in that big question of, are we alone in the universe? They weren't doing this to have some sort of like cosmic understanding or some sort of existential understanding. They wanted to know if the Air Force was able to establish a base on Mars, if they could use any life that they found there to fuel their base. So this is a very instrumental regard for extraterrestrial biology. This idea that if it's there, we can just use it without any sort of ethical considerations whatsoever. So for me, understanding that this sort of idea of like wondering about extraterrestrial life is tied to this big existential question, didn't exist in this moment or wasn't of interest to these scientists who started astrobiology, that to me was a major aha moment.
Well, I will say that I thought this conversation was out of this world, and I mean that literally and figuratively in this case. Jordan, you're an amazing thought leader in this area. We are grateful for your teaching a class at Graham this autumn. I see many people chiming in and nodding to the same effect here. Thank you for having the conversation with us this afternoon and for helping us to really demystify this really important and long known part of our universe. And thank you all for joining us. And for those who are in Chicago, I hope you stay dry amidst the inclement weather all around us. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Dean Green. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.